Good morning. I'm Shane Matthew, and welcome to Good to Great Business Continuity. We're going to examine a series of disciplines that were found in companies that exemplify greatness when compared to their peers. And we're going to determine if those same principles could be found in business continuity programs that on the surface also seem like they're great. Because if that's true, I believe you should consider these principles and apply them to your programs. My name is Shane Matthew, and I work with Virtual Corporation, a business continuity consulting and software products firm. Our mission is to simplify your business by lowering the complexity and cost of business continuity. Now, we have a practice that includes business continuity, crisis management, IT disaster recovery, cybersecurity, and we have our own BCM software tool called Sustainable Planner. So please make sure you visit our booth this week and talk with us to learn more. And that's really all I'm going to say about our company today. Now, as for myself, I've been a BC practitioner for 12 years, and in that time, I've worked in healthcare, government, and Fortune 100 companies. Now, recently, I started a journey to discover what makes business continuity programs great. I've attempted to do this by interviewing innovators in the business continuity industry through my new podcast, The Failover Plan. It's been an interesting journey so far, and it really has opened my eyes to the fact that I don't know as much as I thought. In the podcast interviews, I've been able to talk with people who are really doing things differently, and that's why this topic is so interesting to me. So let's get started. All right, I want to start with a story. Now, on March 11th at 2:46 p.m. local time, some 72 kilometers off the coast of Japan, the Pacific Plate broke its locked fault line and began to shear downward and westward, while the plate beneath it, the one that contains much of northern Japan, thrust upward and eastward. This event caused a massive earthquake, later measured at 9.0 on the Richter scale. Now, in Japan, the shockwave reached and then passed, and many experienced the rolling motion, which lasted for about 4 to 5 minutes. But the disaster was only beginning, because earthquakes in the Pacific Ring of Fire have an ironic tendency to produce walls of water. About 30 minutes after the shaking ended, a tsunami 2 to 3 times higher than projected overwhelmed the seawalls and inundated the shores. And in some cases, a 20-meter high wall of water hit the coastal areas nearest the epicenter of the quake. Now, Japan is home to many technology firms. Specifically impacted was Intel, one of the world's largest and highest valued semiconductor chip makers. While Intel has no factories in Japan, it has numerous suppliers who are, as well as staff. And these suppliers produce the ultra-pure materials needed for Intel's chips, which are consumed at such a rapid pace that even a slight disruption could impact Intel's ability to keep up with demand around the globe. Now, because of this, Intel's response was swift. On the very next day, March 12th, Intel activated its Corporate Emergency Operations Center to help coordinate the response. Intel has split its response to the Japan disaster into 2 parallel streams of activities. There was the emergency management side and the business continuity side. Because of this time, I'm not going to go into the whole response because the emphasis of this presentation is not to the response of a single event, though it certainly supports the claim that Intel's approach to BC could fit into the category of Hall of Fame programs. But let's just say the event proved that how Intel approached BC positioned them to respond really well. Here's some highlights from that response. Now, because they had no factories in Japan, supplier issues were really their main focus. So Intel was able to quickly assess 365 materials produced by their Tier 1 suppliers by March 15th, just 4 days after the disaster. By March 20th, Intel started tracing its deeper tier suppliers. The company also developed a team of 25 Intel employees from across the globe to get clearance to travel into a no-fly disaster zone. They called it the Japan Rebuilding Team, and because of their connections and because of their practices with local law enforcement and other agencies, they were able to secure this permission. Now, as I mentioned, they do have personnel located in the impacted areas. And in their response, Intel was able to quickly relocate 400 employees. And within 8 months after the disaster, they helped them move into brand new facilities which had Intel's first seismic-resistant ceiling and fire protection systems. Now, this by all hallmarks seems to be a response by a well-honed and perfected strategy around business continuity. In fact, based on the results, it may be considered a really great response based on the outcomes. So the question I have to ask, what are the differences between programs that can do this and others? Is it just a maturity thing? Is it just funding? The second question I have to ask is, if you don't think you could do this now with your program, could you transform your program to become great like them? Now, the focus of this presentation is based around an author. Jim Collins is a business management researcher and teacher at Stanford University, and he asked a very similar question. Now, in the mid-90s, he had written a book where he analyzed companies that had achieved greatness by being intentional from the very beginning. Their goal was greatness from the start, and he examined them in detail to find out what their approach was. But during this research, he found several examples of companies that weren't great from the beginning, but seemingly transformed themselves from good to great. You can see from this graphic here a comparison of stock prices of these special companies he identified. It shows their stock prices compared to their competitors, and you'll notice something happens in the midst of their journey. All of a sudden, they begin to pull away from the pack like a Kentucky Derby winner. And like many of us, Collins really understood that while we have plenty of good, like good schools, good government, good customer service, good can really become oftentimes sufficient. And most companies become quite good at what they do, but they're happy to settle. But if you wanted to become great, Collins really asked that question, what would you have to do? Now you may be asking, why should I care? What is the benefit of transforming my business continuity program from good to great in a similar vein that these companies may have done so? Now, there's a couple of reasons why I'm thinking this is a pertinent conversation to have. Based on the marketplace today, we are obviously in a tremendous time of change in the industry. I and others in the industry have been observing the impact of COVID on business continuity professionals, and it's obvious that those programs that are good enough are often considered against other parts of the company that are good when considering whether we need them or not. There's been a lot of layoffs. There's been a lot of programs being curtailed. So being good enough is just, one thing to consider about yourself. Is that enough? Now, also, business continuity has really been largely unchanged since the 1980s. And engagement has always been a consistent issue for all of us. So the real question is more about why wouldn't you want to have a great business continuity program? And if that's the case, what can we learn from the good to great companies Collins found? Could we apply that same logic to business continuity programs? So our agenda today, we're going to look at the good to great philosophy in more detail. We're going to explore 2 examples of what could be perceived as great business continuity programs. And then by using these examples, we're going to assess whether the principles Jim Collins identified could be applied to your BC program. All right, the challenge. Now, as we discussed, Collins asks the question, why do some companies become great while others languish at merely good? Is it random chance, or is there a common thread amongst the companies that achieve greatness? So in Good to Great, he began to search for companies that defy gravity and converted long-term mediocrity, or worse, into long-term superiority. And as he found them, he and his team began to identify the universal distinguishing characteristics that caused the company to go from good to great. And this book was a bestseller in the early 2000s, and it's still considered to be a book to address when you're building great companies or you want to take yours to the next level. So how did he go about doing this? Well, to begin, he came up with a team that made a list of companies that truly made the leap from good to great. They also identified comparison companies that helped to define what did and didn't make a difference. Next, Collins' 21-person research team read and coded 6,000 articles, generated more than 2,000 pages of interview transcripts, and created enough computer data to quantify the 5-year project. Now, the findings will surprise many readers and, quite frankly, upset some others, like myself. Collins learned that specific factors you normally think of, like that would influence a company to become great, like a CEO compensation, technology, mergers, acquisitions, change management initiatives. In fact, those really did not play a major role in moving a company from good to great. So let's talk about how he chose the companies to examine. So he used some tough benchmarks. The research team identified a set of elite companies that made the leap to great results and sustained those results for at least 15 years. The research team contrasted these companies with carefully selected comparison companies that failed to make the leap. And they really honed in on what was different. And they call it what was inside the black box. What changed? What improved? What actions were taken? And why did they all of a sudden become great performers? So that criteria for what a great company is was the first thing they had to really define. So Collins used 3 criteria. The first was cumulative returns of at least 3 times the market over the 15-year period after they, hit that black box point, after they hit that turning point. They also had to demonstrate this pattern was independent of their industry. So they had to look and see that the companies all in that space were not all improving, but instead one just took off from the rest of the pack. And they also had to show a consistent pattern of results. Now you'll see here a list of the companies that they ultimately identified for examination. Now some of those companies are still around, others are not. And that's a whole separate discussion that you can have because there's been quite a bit of analysis done about Collins' research after the fact in these companies that are on this list. But for the sake of our discussion today, after the leap, these good to great companies generated cumulative stock returns that beat the general stock market by an average of 7 times in 15 years. Now, that's better than twice the results delivered by a composite index of the world's greatest companies, including Coca-Cola, General Electric, and Merck. So there is something distinct about these companies, and they did meet the criteria of what we would consider to be great. Now, from their research, Collins and team found that each of the great companies had numerous similarities. And after a lot of review, he was able to develop a framework of concepts that was common to them all. Now, the framework is depicted here. This is a diagram straight from the book, and it encompasses 3 main components. The first is kind of the process. The companies they identify went through a process of setting themselves up for greatness, aka he calls it the build-up. And then they hit this inflection point that takes them to greatness, aka he calls it breakthrough. Secondly, there was some distinct phases in this activity. There was 3. He broke it down in the following way. First, the companies acquired disciplined people, getting the right leader and the right team together. They next focused on disciplined thought, which involves understanding the brutal facts about who they are and what they're capable of, and creating a set of core values they live by. And then third, they take to disciplined action. They would create a robust culture where the right people will work within the defined core values with the appropriate freedom. Now, Collins also talks about this concept of the flywheel, which is a quiet and deliberate process of figuring out what needs to be done for the best future results, and taking those step by step, pushing the flywheel in a consistent direction until it achieves a breakthrough point. But let's examine the phases in a little more detail, because I think that's really where you'll start to see some of the things we'll see in business continuity programs that we could apply. All right, the first concept is a level 5 leadership. Now, as you would imagine, you would typically believe that a great company has great leadership. Now, Collins, in fact, did his absolute best to not put the weight of great companies on simply by having a great leader. Okay, he felt And in fact, he argued with his researchers to ignore the leaders of a company during the research. But at the end, the data actually won out, that you had to pay attention to that had a strong influence on a great company. Now, the comparison companies were also examined too, but what he found in the research was that the great companies had leaders that were all seemingly cut from the same cloth. Now, again, you would imagine that leadership has a direct influence, but you would not imagine the type of leaders that they were finding in these companies. In fact, when you compared them to many high-profile leaders with big personalities who make headlines, the good to great company leaders tended to feel like they were a little bit from Mars. All right, the common thread in the analysis. The level 5 leaders possessed a combination of humility plus will. Now, the term level 5 alone is something that Collins had come up with. If you see this diagram here, level 5 refers to the highest level in a hierarchy of executive capabilities that Collins identified and displayed. Now, level 5 leaders channel their ego needs away from themselves into the larger goal of building a great company. They are ambitious, but their ambition is first and foremost for the institution, not for themselves. A level 5 leader is an individual who blends extreme personal humility with intense professional will, like I said. They are self-effacing individuals who displayed the fierce resolve to do whatever needed to be done to make the company great. One example of this, which was consistent in each of the companies they identified as good to great, was the leader's ambition for the company. So you'll see it manifest in things like even selecting successors. These level 5 leaders were so enamored with the idea of keeping their company going forward long after they left that they would pick people that were qualified and prepared them. So one example was the example of David Maxwell, who became CEO of Fannie Mae in 1981. At that time, the company was losing $1 million every single business day, and over the next 9 years, Maxwell transformed Fannie Mae into an ultra-high performance culture that rivaled even the best Wall Street firms. Ultimately, they were earning about $4 million a day at near the end of his tenure. Now, when he retired, he picked an equally capable successor, Jim Johnson. And shortly thereafter, Maxwell's retirement package, which was large due to Fannie Mae's successes, became a point of controversy. And Maxwell, sensing this would trigger an adverse reaction in Washington, which obviously oversees Fannie Mae, and thus potentially jeopardized the future success of the company, decided to give back $5.5 million of his executive bonus to the Fannie Mae Foundation for Low-Income Housing. Now, that's obviously the type of person that demonstrates this ideal of focusing on the success of the company. And that's the type of leaders you really need to have in these organizations in order to get to the great status. All right, the second concept he talks about is the concept of first who and then what. Now, Collins found that good to great companies recognize that it's important to assemble a team of great people first and then decide on the strategy or vision for the company to make it great. In other words, they first got to get the right people on the bus and the wrong people off of it, and then figured out where to drive it after that. Now, typically you can see two models of leadership in play in a lot of companies. The one on the right depicts the good to great model. And an example of that was Walgreens. Cork Walgreen demonstrated a knack for picking a good team of executives, and they carried the company forward long after he left. Now, the model on the right is the genius with 1,000 helpers model, and that's what you unfortunately see in a lot of places nowadays. And the idea there is that you pick one person who comes up with a strategy, and then you just put in the people that will incorporate and get that strategy done. Right? Well, what happens when that person leaves? And that's a common issue. For example, in Eckerd's. Eckerd's is this great pharmacy chain that used to be around for a long time, and it really followed that model on the right. They had a great leader in Jack Eckerd, who built a company from one store in Delaware to over 1,000 across the southeastern United States. But when Jack left the company to pursue political office, Eckerd's began a really long decline, eventually being acquired by J.C. Penney, which shows you how far it fell. Now, this model is many good companies follow that model of genius with 1,000 helpers, right? And again, you're basing it around a single charismatic leader. But when you look at the good to great models, you're really seeing that those companies that excel were the ones that chose the level 5 approach. Again, if you have the wrong people, it doesn't matter whether you discover the right direction. You still won't have a great company. Great vision without great people is irrelevant. All right, concept number 3. Good to great companies confront the brutal facts yet never lose faith. Now, this concept can be best explained by discussing the Stockdale Paradox. Now, Admiral Jim Stockdale, which is pictured here, was the highest-ranking U.S. officer in the Hanoi Hilton, which was a prisoner of war camp during the height of the Vietnam War. And he was tortured over 20 times during his 8-year imprisonment, and he lived out the war with no rights, no release date, no certainty he would see his family, but yet he survived. He survived because he realized that the people who didn't make it out were the optimists. He said the ones who were saying, we're going to get out by Christmas, and then when they didn't, they'd say, oh, we're going to get out by Easter, and so on, until they would give up hope. Those are the ones who didn't survive. Instead, he said, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever that might be. And the way he approached that was that he did things in the imprisonment that kept his fellow prisoners, their hope alive, and continue to work to pass along information to the CIA and do things that he just understood, hey, this is the reality I'm in. I've got to face that reality and live accordingly. So this Stockdale Paradox is what we're really seeing in concept number 3. All right, Collins had identified that one of the most important recipes toward becoming a good to great company is to make a really series of good decisions. But good decisions cannot be made unless you confront the brutal facts. And the best example I saw in the book was the comparison between 2 grocery chains, the A&P stores and Kroger. Now, if you're old enough to remember A&P, then I feel bad because I'm in your same age range. But in the first half of the 20th century, during the World War II era, consumers were really used to frugality at that point, and their grocery stores really reflected that. Now, in this latter half of the 20th century, when the U.S. was experiencing its increasing affluence, consumers began showing more interest in the bigger, newer, cleaner stores with the more choices. They wanted fresh baked bread, flowers. They wanted to do their banking while they did their grocery shopping. They just wanted everything to be in one place, and they were wanting larger stores. Now, Kroger, A&P's competitor, faced the same reality that consumer tastes were changing, but they faced it in a different way. They faced the reality that their model would have to change significantly. And so what they did was they came up with what's now known as the superstore concept. So by accepting the reality, they were able to transform, and Kroger is still one of the top grocery chains today, while A&P is no more. So a primary task in taking a company from good to great is to create a culture wherein people are okay with facing the cold, hard reality of their environment. And they ensure that their people have a tremendous opportunity to be heard, and ultimately for the truth to be heard. All right, concept number 4. Now, this was a big one identified in good to great companies. Just the idea of answering the question, are you a hedgehog or a fox? The hedgehog concept is based on the famous essay by Isaiah Berlin, which is called The Hedgehog and the Fox, and which describes the differences between the 2 natural enemies. The fox is a cunning creature able to devise a myriad of complex strategies for sneak attacks upon the hedgehog. All right, they're able to do multiple tasks. Foxes are able to bounce around from one thing to the next. They really understand and use their intelligence well, but they also create some complexity. On the other hand, hedgehogs have a very simplified worldview. They're if you don't know, hedgehogs are more like a mix between a porcupine and a small armadillo. And they just waddle along, enjoying a simplified view of the world. They focus completely on one task at a time. But no matter how many times the fox tries, whether it devises a sneak attack or sneaks up from behind, the hedgehog simply just rolls up in a ball and keeps its sharp spikes pointing outwards. So when they have conflicts, the hedgehog usually wins. It just uses its tried and true approach. So, Collins found that companies that really were hedgehogs, where they were really focused on being the best in the world at one thing, they were the ones who succeeded. So in the book, Jim Collins recounts the story of how Walgreens, their CEO, Cork Walgreen, grew the company to be the largest drug retailing chain in America. $1 invested in 1975 skyrocketed to $562 by 2000 under his leadership. Now, Walgreens decided that their concept was to be the best, most convenient drugstore with the highest profit per customer. But executing on that strategy would conflict with the defining core metric in the drugstore world up to that point. The defining metric for the drugstores were usually around the profit per store, okay, instead of profit per customer. And that really incentivized those companies to reduce the number of more expensive, convenient locations and to buy less convenient ones at cheaper or more remote locations. Now, Walgreens realized they'd be able to compete at the same level with other drugstores if they followed that model, but to be great, they had to switch to a focus of convenience, and therefore their core metric would have to shift from profit per store to profit per customer visit. That shift in metric, which was as a result of their Hedgehog concept, played a huge role in aligning the company's focus. So because they had no longer focused on profit per store, they really replaced a lot of their inconvenient locations with more convenient ones. They bought up corner lots with multiple entries and exits for its customers. They would close down perfectly good stores to move them a block away if it was more convenient on a corner location. In cities, it would even cluster multiple stores in a single mile radius so that customers only had to walk a few blocks to get to the nearest Walgreens. And again, based on the Hedgehog concept and in support of that key metric, Walgreens invested in a number of services to optimize the customer's convenience once they're in the store. So they had things like the 1-hour photo stop. They pioneered the concept of the drive-through pharmacy. They just did a lot of things to make it a convenient experience because they based it all around that one concept. Now, there's 3 dimensions to the Hedgehog concept as illustrated in this diagram. The Hedgehog concept is not supposed to be seen as a literal strategy to becoming the best at something. The goal is to understand what you can be the best at and what you can't. The good companies, or the good to great companies, answer the following questions of what can you be best at in the world, what drives your economic engine, what are you deeply passionate about. Again, remember, this is not the same as a core competence. You can have a competence at something, but not necessarily have the potential to be the best in the world. For example, think of it this way. Perhaps in high school you got straight A's in calculus, you score well on the math portion of the SAT. Does that mean you major in mathematics in college? Maybe. Maybe you decide, I'm going to take a few courses in college and you do well. But when you get to the final, it takes you the 3 full hours, while there are hyper math-oriented people in the same class that finish in 30 minutes because they're just wired differently and can do math so much better. And you finally realize that you can never be one of the best. So just like in this example, companies have pulled into the area that they can never quite attain mastery around. They're just competent, but they won't be great. So to go from good to great requires a deep understanding of the 3 intersecting circles translated into that in that diagram above. All right, concept number 5, the culture of discipline. Now, Collins found that sustaining great results often over a long period of time requires a team full of self-disciplined people. Now, according to this research, good to great companies have a disciplined culture that is fanatically consistent with the 3 circles of the Hedgehog concept. But how do these companies create a culture of discipline? So the number 1 concept I'm going to focus in on is the freedom within a framework concept. Good to great companies hire self-disciplined employees and set clear restraints, and that way they can focus their energy on managing the system and not the people. That is the number 1 takeaway from the culture of discipline. Just imagine it this way. So think of an airline pilot. Now, she's sitting in a cockpit surrounded by switches and gauges, sitting on top of 84 million pieces or $84 million worth of equipment. And she gets clear for departure. She works with air traffic control, following precise instructions like where to taxi, what runway to use, what direction to take off in. She doesn't depart till she's cleared, and once she's in flight, she communicates constantly with air traffic control, following their directions. But say she's landing and she's going through a thunderstorm before she lands, which can really wreak havoc on her landing. As she's about to hit her landing, if she senses a bad crosswind, she can suddenly thrust that plane back in the air, ready to make another go-around if she felt like she needed to. So step back and think about this model. The pilot operates within a very strict system, and she doesn't have the freedom to simply go outside the system. Yet at the same time, during crucial decisions, whether it's takeoff or landing or to abort, it really rests with the pilot. So the good to great companies built a consistent system with clear constraints, but they also gave people freedom and responsibility within that framework. They hired self-disciplined people, or they got self-disciplined people to work with them who really didn't need to be managed. They just gave them the system and coached them on how to use it. Right? So they managed the system, not the people. And this is really a concept you have to think. But you really have to understand that if you get the hedgehog principle right, then the culture of discipline kind of has to tie into that too. All right, last thing Collins noticed was technology. The principal message here is that technology is really important in the growth of future businesses. But in his research, Collins found that good to great companies did not blindly follow new technologies. They were rather just diligent about knowing what technology can accelerate the existing momentum. So basically, the technology fit in with their hedgehog concept. They were not attracted to fads, but rather deep thought on whether the application of the right technology would propel them to the next level. Okay? All right, so these are the concepts that Collins found. So now that we understand what Collins found in his research, what I did next was try to conduct a little experiment to determine if one could apply these same principles to a business continuity program. So next we want to discuss some programs that appear to have hit that greatness mark and analyze if the principles of good to great are apparent in them, because then we can apply that same logic to our own programs. Now first, however, I had to determine what greatness in BC truly means. In Collins' research, he had a simple metric that really establishes how a company is doing, its stock price. In business continuity, we don't have an objective measuring stick for how well a program is doing, or really even a way to demonstrate that a BC program is good. So for this presentation, I had to develop some standards of my own so we could agree that the program would qualify for further analysis. So for the record, I searched for an objective measure of what a good BC program has and thought it was a long shot. There's not really much research out there on what a great one looked like. So I really came up short there. So for this analysis, I decided to classify a great program in the following ways. First, the great BC program must have a demonstrated longevity, a lifespan at a minimum of 7 years. I picked 7 because that's more than the average time an executive stays in an organization. Therefore, if the program can hit that mark without being cut, it's doing something right and not just dependent on a good executive supporting them. Okay. Secondly, the company the BC program is at or for is a complex company with multiple divisions. Okay. The company also had to be multinational with locations spread out over the world. And the BC program responsibilities are shared throughout the organization, not just simply owned by corporate. So let me just pause and say a few things about my selection process. Number 1, this is my criteria. In the absence of a unified definition of what great means to the industry, I've had to develop this based on my experience. Number 2, this is a huge issue in our industry. We have thousands of articles written about how to implement a program, but not a standard definition of what a great one should do. This is a challenge to everyone who's listening, that we really need as an industry a set of criteria that makes a program good and also recognizes those that are great. If you got ideas on this, let me know. I'd love to discuss this topic more. Now, due to a small thing called the global pandemic, I also want to say that, let's just say people were a little bit busy during this time frame since when I first came up with the idea in March. So getting a hold of people to interview for this presentation was challenging. But I was able to get some insights through interviews that I read or reading that I found about these programs. Now, that being said, I found 2 programs that met the criteria that I've set. The first is Intel. Now, Intel, as I mentioned before, is an American multinational technology firm headquartered in California. It's one of the largest and highest valued semiconductor chip makers. Okay, they have a population of employees of about 110,000 people. They have 132 global sites at the last time I checked. I did some research on the BC programs. They have a corporate program, which was headed up by a fairly well-known person in the industry named Howard Pierpoint, and now most recently led by Catherine Dornfield, which is another high-profile leader. They had this organizational based business continuity firm practices. So they have a corporate, and then they have within each division, that were specific divisions, excuse me. And their corporate team is about 7 people or so. Okay. Now, the second company that I want to examine is eBay. Now, eBay is, as many of you know, a multinational e-commerce corp based in California that really facilitates consumer-to-consumer and business-to-consumer sales through its website, its eBay auction site, right? It has employee population of about 13,000 employees, about 140 global sites. And their BC leader is someone that's well recognized as a thought leader in the industry. His name is Scott Baldwin, and he served from 2011 to 2017. And at that time, their program was about 6 to 7 people. And they used BC liaisons, which were employees with other duties as assigned to business continuity. Okay, let's talk about Intel first. The program started after September 11th. The Intel CEOs took the lessons of that day to heart. They actually wrote in a message to the board of directors, the events of 9/11 were a wake-up call to expect the unexpected. Employees, customers, stockholders, and the investment community are all raising the bar on what is expected of corporations, and every Intel organization must make BC a core business practice. Their program focus, from what I've learned, is to be prepared enough. I thought that was quite interesting. And that philosophy is that based on the fact that the task of planning responses or mitigating risks could easily overwhelm the organization if they let it. So this guiding principle allows the focus to be on reducing impacts rather than planning for the loss of each function or planning for every scenario. Now, this is a map of how the Intel program moved through the various phases of maturity. And like many other programs, they start due to an incident. And that was 9/11 in this case. And then they moved into, kind of phases focused on crisis management and business continuity. And then they moved into intense business continuity focus, largely getting the compliance tasks aspects of business continuity done. And that's where many programs seem to stay. But instead, Intel's program demonstrated that in a relatively short amount of time, that they could grow past that level of maturity and move into more of a, proactive state. And that's really where it started to ingrain in the corporate culture. Now, their corporate framework is standardized. And remember I mentioned freedom within a framework, right? And they actually do have a framework which is quite clear through various materials I read. The framework is really around developing plans, which is building a BC plan based on the findings from the risk and impact assessment. Okay, and basically, plan owners evaluate risk, identify controls, assess the business impacts, and develop strategies that address the impacts. That's really the cornerstone of their planning. They test and maintain plans. They assess performance and update plans after that. They really get into the idea of performance metrics, preventative actions, and assessing whether they work and updating their plans. And they have a BC champion for every organizational component, which conducts internal audits to verify the plan meets requirements. And the last phase of their framework is to review and improve the program. And through this process, they strengthen plans based upon discoveries made during tests or real-life events. Each org takes the data they've collected in the audits or in real-life examples and funnels it up to the corporate team so that the sources of feedback influence the ongoing development and improvement of the corporate-wide VC program. So there's a feedback loop involved in their program. Right? Now, in my research, I found multiple documents about the program itself. Their framework is definitely standardized throughout all the organizations because BC is considered a formal business process, much like customer service or manufacturing. And the BC organization was required to own it. And because of this decentralized approach, the corporate program focused on creating toolkits, presentations, common methods, common reporting procedures, and they would coach the message throughout all the business units. And the major divisions deemed critical had an internal program of their own. There were several that had their own BC manager that was hired full-time for this. All right. So this is an example depicted here of the Intel IT division, which again has its own BC program. Now, every BC program participated in their corporate emergency operations structure, which is generally focused on crisis management and coordinated multi-site emergency response. They would also be responsible for leading site emergency operations centers as needed and driving overall business continuity efforts. So furthering down the road here, for Intel, each division is responsible for mitigation strategy development, They were responsible for conducting drills to test their business continuity plans and incorporating executive management of those drills. Other notes I found kind of interesting was that the BC plans are subject to audit, as I mentioned, by the review, but they're audited also potentially by the board of directors. And then also, Intel requires business groups that are applying for Intel's top quality awards to include a business continuity element as part of their submission. So it's definitely ingrained. Okay. Now, they have a considerable amount of response involved in the pandemic. Because of time, I'm not going to go through all of the things they did, but in a nutshell, they really faced the same issues many other companies faced, and they were able to apply their business continuity functionality to all these issues. Right? For example, they had remote work issues. They had to move 100,000 employees to work remotely, and I also had to do things like change their manufacturing environment because a lot of them included the ability to monitor highly automated processes, which up till that point was done in person, but because of the pandemic, they had to do it from remote workstations. So they had to build all that on the fly, right? But because of they had identified the impacts of loss of personnel, they had some of these things already built up and ready to go. All right, so let's jump over to eBay. I also want to include their program because they met the criteria for greatness, but I wanted to ensure that we could see the greatness concepts applied in a different industry. So with eBay, I chose them also because I had a very strong connection with the program leader that grew the program. So the program itself had multiple iterations after the company inception in the 90s. In fact, by the time the subject of my analysis began to lead the program, it was in its 6th iteration. Okay, their focus was to build an army of engaged resiliency planners. That's their Hedgehog Concept. Now, Scott Baldwin, who was there from 2011 to 2017, served as the global head of business continuity. All right, and he led the effort to rebuild the enterprise BC program after the eBay PayPal split. And he has a very clear framework to achieve focus on building engaged planners. So some of my immediate observations, I think others agree with me on, is that I think you actually have a level 5 leader in the wild here. I personally work with Scott on various projects, and I work with people who know him and work for him, and they can all attest to these tendencies. In fact, when I talked to him about this presentation and asked him about his successes, he attributed it to luck and a good team, which was similar to what many of the examples of leaders within the Good to Great book stated as well. Now, as other programs are built around a framework, this is the same thing we've seen here in eBay's program. So this is the framework that I'm not going to go into tremendous detail here because of time. There is a great presentation that Scott did a few years ago, which I'll link to in my notes, and it explains his philosophy. But he bases his framework around 3 maturity levels. And it's very, again, similar to what Intel was demonstrating in their program, is that, you start at the very base level of compliance, okay? And with compliance, the idea is that you're really, that's the foundation. It's the absolute minimum requirements for a functional enterprise program, and it basically means get the basic components of BC done. All right, and in eBay's case, they had some financial regulations that warranted the need for these BC components to be activated, so BC BIAs, BC plans, etc. But then he also, in the framework, moved to what he called a second phase, readiness, which is the ability for the business to respond to a disruption or impact. So this is based around a little bit more of the framework of compliance has to be achieved first, but during readiness, the ownership of BC truly needs to be in the hands of the business. And it's also supported by a corporate team building realistic, useful, and regular functional exercises. Now, once you've gone past readiness, the framework was focused on resilience. Okay, this is when the organization focuses attention on proactively identifying and mitigating risks to avoid impact. Again, you have to achieve compliance and readiness to get to resilience. But once you've done this, the corporate team can really just spend their time working on identifying risk areas, mitigating them, and avoiding the impacts that these risks could cause. It really frees up their time. And I strongly recommend viewing that presentation. It'll give you a very clear understanding of Baldwin's approach. So again, I'm not going to go through every step of the framework today because of the time frames, but I want to highlight some of the unique facts. So up till then, during Baldwin's time in the program, the program he managed was the longest lasting BCM program. As I mentioned, there were several iterations that kept getting rebooted until Baldwin showed up. The program was the first to reach all 140 sites across the world, and they were the first to begin proactive risk reduction exercises, primarily because Scott was able to implement that framework and the corporate team's bandwidth was increased. All right, so what can you do to start building a great business continuity program? How can we take the lessons we've seen from the book, from Collins's observations to the programs that we are considering to be great? You kind of have to ask yourself, so what? You've talked about all this, but, and you've put some great BC programs in, which are, of course, my opinion, in front of me. What does that mean? Okay. Well, the first question you have to ask yourself is, do you even want your program to become great? Or are you okay with good? Many are fine with the status quo. And if you are, you may want to consider the environment we're on if you're on the fence there, you may want to consider the environment we're in today. First of all, as I mentioned, we're in the midst of an unprecedented global pandemic. Businesses are going to be really examining programs to determine how valuable they are. Secondly, there's a genuine concern about the current methodology as a business continuity. We're primarily data management focused in a lot of ways in our activity. So if that's what you're doing, that's what a good program is, that may not be enough. Okay, that might not be enough to warrant keeping it around. Third, even good programs are susceptible to the reboot cycle. When the going gets tough, it's easy to take a program that doesn't present immense value and shut it down till the next major event happens. We've all seen that happen. So with that in mind, I think it's vitally important for you to do everything possible to create a great business continuity program. So let's review some of the concepts real quickly again to see if this is apparent in the programs I've highlighted for you in Intel and eBay. All right, just as a recap, the good to great principles are broken down into 3 pieces: disciplined people, disciplined thought, disciplined action. Okay, so let's talk about level 5 leadership. Now, in both programs we examined, Intel and eBay, I noticed they had some great leaders, ones with tremendous tenure and well-respected beyond their organization. Now, Scott Baldwin at eBay is an influential speaker and involved with leadership at the industry level. He had a lot of characteristics that put him in the level 5 strata. And as we're speaking with business continuity professionals or leaders in general, the common question that will come up is, well, can I learn to be a level 5 if I don't feel like I am right now? And the simple answer is maybe. There are 2 groups of people, those who aren't willing to transform and those who are. But I think the key message is that even if you're not, that if you implement the remainder of these concepts, all right, then you will become a level 5 leader. So then let's talk about concept 2. First who, then what? Well, the first modification in this decision is to move from the genius with helpers mindset to the level 5 leader with team mindset. And once you shift that thinking, you have to ask, how do you know if I have the right team? Okay? A key quality of the right team is whether you believe they could take over when you're gone. All right? Remember, picking who and then what involves believing the team also wants to achieve success in the program, not just simply wants a job. Now, with the eBay program, and due to my direct experience with Scott Baldwin, he specifically said that he hired the right people for the approach, and I saw that. And he was taking, the approach he was taking with the program really designed the personnel, the qualities. Okay, so when he hired people, he didn't really look at credentials or past experience, but instead focused on the cultural fit and the team fit, the team dynamic fit, their personality. He typically found people that he thought were gifted teachers and motivators because he felt like he could teach them BC skills, but he needed those intrinsic capabilities to match the scope of the program that he was designing, okay, and in the scope of the way he liked to work. So what are some immediate steps you can think and consider is, when you're in doubt, don't hire, keep looking. That's the biggest thing. I know a lot of times we have the tendency, hey, we got some money, we got a resource that I'm allowed to hire now. We want to just fill the shoes before the money goes away. Don't do that if at all possible. If you really want a great program, you got to hire right. Okay? And, when you know you need to make a people change, act. Don't wait. Another thing is hire people that are willing to debate with you. Okay, there's an example of a BC professional friend of mine named Jose Garay from Peru. He was exploring adaptive business continuity, that model for his program, and he decided to implement it. But luckily he had the right people on his team who they all immediately started debating the direction Jose was going in. Okay, and they came to a conclusion that, hey, let's go ahead and pilot this approach, this change, before we roll it out to the whole company. And through that debate and dialogue, they ended up with a pilot that gave them the opportunity to test things out, and everybody was on the same page ultimately when they decided, yeah, let's move forward. Okay? All right, disciplined thought. Now, in both great programs I examined, the commonality is that they both realized that simply conducting the basic tasks of business continuity was not enough. They had to accept that the program had to be based on something more. Okay, in Intel's case, they realized that their company was large, diverse, and they had huge divisions within with its own ecosystems. Now, a corporate team trying to drive BC practices for a multinational company would require resources far beyond what they could procure. Remember, their philosophy at Intel was good enough. All right. So the leadership developing their program from the start realized that the ownership had to come from the business. This brutal reality they faced that the BC program could not be all encompassing and time consuming, and only looked at impacts rather than every single process. That reality crafted how they approached their program going forward. Now, in eBay's case, the brutal fact was that there's been many programs before their iteration. So executives come and go. They couldn't rely on a single champion at the top driving this. So their brutal fact was that if they didn't ensure engagement within each work unit, they would be toast. So what are some ways that you as a BC leader can create a climate where the brutal truth is heard and the facts are confronted? Well, the first thing is lead with questions, not answers. Use questions as a way to gain understanding about your program. So questions you have to ask yourself are things like, what are we doing wrong? What negative impressions are out there about us? If we weren't here, can others do what we do in our place? And are we doing the right thing to make the business successful, even in disruption? From Colin's experience, the good to great leaders made particularly good use of informal meetings where they'd meet with a group of managers and employees with no script or agenda or set action items. Instead, they would just simply start with the questions like, so what's on your mind? Can you tell me, what's happening? Help me understand, what's happening with your business area, with the business continuity program. What should we be worried about? And this is really powerful as a BC manager. This is when you can really get some insight on whether your methodology is working or not. I remember having this type of dialogue with a colleague of mine when I was leading a BC program. And it started just as a casual check-in and ended up with me understanding that the approach to impact analysis was missing some vital elements. You can't gain this insight unless you're willing to have those brutally honest conversations. Concept number 4. Disciplined thought. Remember I mentioned the Hedgehog Concept. It's not the goal to be the best. Or strategy to be the best. Or plan to be the best. It's an understanding of what you can be the best at. So just because something is your core business, just because you've been doing it for years, does not necessarily mean that you can be the best at the world in it. And if you can't be the best in the world at it, then it's not a Hedgehog Concept. So think of it this way. Could you take the BC program you created and transport it to a completely different company and expect it will be able to be successful? No. It has to be thought around, and your program's ability has to be understood. So how did Intel and eBay do this? Well, Collins wrote that you need to find the intersection of 3 questions. What can you be best at in the world? What are you deeply passionate about? What's your economic drivers? For the deeply passionate part, for a business continuity program, what ignites the passion of you and your team about the business continuity program? Okay. And in the driver sense, think about it in the economic driver sense. If you could pick one ratio to systematically increase over time, what would that ratio be? Okay. Many programs pick this economic driver being the number of plans they write each year or the number of exercises they complete. But isn't that what other good programs do? What do great programs do? Now, Intel did have a Hedgehog Concept. At least I believe they did. In Intel's case, theirs was that they were going to be the best at identifying risk impacts and prioritizing them to ensure they prepared enough. Okay, what does that mean? If you look at this figure, this is from a paper written by the BC program leads within one of the largest Intel divisions, Materials. It describes the process by which Materials assessed BC risk and identified key vulnerabilities. Now, in this case, Intel realized that with such a large organization, plan writing would be tremendously time-consuming. And though it may be helpful, finding ways to reduce vulnerabilities and effectively use funding to reduce risk was far more aligned with what the business focus of revenue was. Now, eBay's Hedgehog Concept is a little different. In my assessment, their interest was in building not only planners within the business, but engaged one. One story Scott told me that they had created a community of practice, whereas when they'd meet, the BC manager for that team would have to present on their program and the risks they found or their exercise results. Other BC managers would often offer their guidance about lessons they'd learned themselves, which enabled them all to do what we're doing here today, learning from each other. And when you felt a community of other planners around you, it's easy to want to accelerate your program and take it seriously. The one thing that you do better than others is clear for both programs. But it takes thoughtfulness to get there, and you have to do that for your program. Concept 5 is really a culture of discipline. It's not just about action. When you look at these two programs, they may look a little pedestrian and boring from the outside, but when you look at it more closely, it really comes down to following the Hedgehog Concept and being disciplined enough to do so all the time, even if something else pops up. Now, for a BC program, it's very easy to try to take on other company responsibilities that you can be seen as a value-added contributor. But the great programs realize that just hampers your ability in the one area you can be best at. So don't launch into tangential disciplines. Don't take on the responsibility of others in the org. In both the Intel program and the eBay program, they didn't focus on becoming something they weren't or taking on the tasks that the business should be responsible for. In fact, they purposely pushed these away so they could focus on being strategic. In Concept 6, technology-induced change is nothing new, right? The real question is not what is the role of technology, but rather the question should be how do great organizations think differently about it? And in this case, I think a lot of BC programs start out thinking immediately, we got to buy software. And then that software crafts how they act and what they do. Now, the evidence of the study in Collins' case indicated that while technology is great, it was never the reason why a company accelerated to greatness. So we have to think of differently about technology in business continuity as well, and avoid the technology bandwagons. In the eBay program, for example, software was not the primary driver of the activity. It was a tool, much like a mass notification system. They had BCM software, but you wouldn't know that was the central point of eBay's program based on what you learned and what they did. The central point of their program instead was engaged planners. Now, with Jim Collins, when he was writing this book, one of the students asked him, why should I try to build a great company? What if I just want to be successful? And I think that's a question we commonly ask ourselves. Now, obviously, if you're listening to the presentation, you may be asking yourself that same thing. And there's really two ways to respond. The first is that you have to see that based on the Hedgehog Concept alone, it's not really harder to build something great than it is to build something good. Now, maybe it may be harder statistically to become an Intel or an eBay, but it doesn't necessarily require more work. It really just requires a simplified approach to what you will make, a simplified approach to what you think will make you great. It's something everybody identifies and simply just has to understand is that, when you're looking at the Hedgehog Concept, you have to decide, for example, the idea that, hey, look, you have to find out what you're best at and just do that really well, and that leads to great results, okay? So it doesn't necessarily mean more work for yourself. Now, secondly, you have to come to grips with the fact that perhaps having a great BC program isn't what you're interested in doing. Perhaps you're focused on other things outside of work. Perhaps your organization doesn't value it. There may be a lot of reasons. But in today's business environment, it really calls into question that our approach has to be great. I think even good programs are being scrutinized. Great programs have a better chance of demonstrating value and making their programs hard to trim. So thank you for joining me today. I love to hear your feedback on what you think a great business continuity program looks like or the benchmarks we should use going forward. Please don't hesitate to contact me so we can continue this dialogue.